we can say that Ruby is sleek, elegant programming language. What this means? Most of our used programming languages focus mainly on helping the computer to understand the code lines we write to build the business logic, not on the developers and its happy life while coding this whole program, never mind from the developers. They should work and don't give. Yes. But Ruby mainly focus on the developer first to make his life happy while coding the application. It gives the ability for the users to write the code lines just writing an English letter. If we have an example to see this feature, if we need to create a for loop 5 times to print hi. No need to define the index variable and write a code that will increment this index variable from 1 to 5. No, just write it as you say it in English. Please 5 times print hi. And Ruby will do that. As in this example, just this Ruby code line that will print hi 5 times. 5 times print hi. Do you see that before? So Ruby is sleek. Another example is how it deals with conditions. If we need to print the word done according to counter variable equals 0 and another method is done that should return true, this is the old fashion. You write it. If another one, not a developer, reads these lines, he will not understand these lines. But in Ruby style, as I said, you write it as you said it in English. Please print done if counter.0 or done. If anyone sees this line, he will understand what's the meaning of this code line, not only the developer. Another example is building functions that can return more than one value in one time. Do you see this before? Okay. We have a definition or a function, def, sum, and the product. It takes 2 arguments and b, and returns the summation and the production of these 2 arguments in the same time. So how can we use this function or call this function? All we need to do is just define 2 variables, sum and the product, equal sum and the product 1 and 2. At runtime, this function will return the summation of 1 and 2 in the sum variable and the production of 1 and 2 in the product variable, just in one line. You will notice that we don't write the brackets in the functional call. Why? Because brackets is optional in Ruby. You don't need to write brackets in a function or method call. So we say how Ruby is an elegant programming language and focus mainly on the developer to make writing codes just write in English words. Let's back to the main definition written in Wikipedia to say how Ruby is an object-oriented. All of us know object-oriented programming, right? What Ruby adds to the object-oriented programming concept is making everything is an object. Even literals are objects. The 12 as a number is not only a literal. It is also object and have some methods. You can get the string value of this 12 number by calling .2s. This will return 12 as a string. Also, negative 12, not only a number. You can get its absolute value by calling negative 12.abs. And vice versa, if you have a string that represents a number, you can convert it into integer by just calling the 2i on this string as a literal, but it's not a literal, but every literal in Ruby is an object. Another side is classes. Even classes in Ruby are objects. If we see this example, if you have a class duck and instantiated a new instance called Duffy from this class, if you ask it a Duffy its class, it will return duck. But even duck, if we ask it, but even the duck, the main class, if we ask it about its class, it will return the big class. Every class in Ruby is an object. Another point that adds to the object-oriented programming is methods. Methods are also objects in Ruby. You can retrieve the method, the summation method of this number 12, get a reference on this method, and deal with it as an object. You can call .arity on this method to know how many arguments it accepts, and also call the method itself by making m.call 5. That returns 17, and this summation of 5 and 12. So even methods in Ruby are objects and can deal with it as an object. This is the first part of the definition, as Ruby is an object-oriented programming language. Second part in the definition is Ruby is a dynamic language. What does this mean? Let's first define small sentence, duck typing. This is mainly what we call about Ruby code line, duck typing. If it talks like a duck and quakes like a duck, I would call it a duck. What does this mean? An object's current set of methods and the properties mainly determine the valid semantics of the object, not the inherited classes or the implemented interfaces. So at runtime, you can change how the class or the object behaves at runtime. Never mind from the super classes or the inherited interfaces, you can change its behavior. You can make a class called dog that implements the methods for how and so on to say a duck behavior. Just change the methods and the properties of the class at runtime to get the valid semantics of the class. Another part from the dynamics of Ruby is meta-programming. What does this mean? Writing code that writes code. So you write one line of code at runtime, this line will produce other code snippets. If we read this example, we first define a class called post. This class extends main class called active record. Active record is a class in Rails, we will talk about it later, that makes a mapping between class models and database tables. The second line says has many comments, as a comment is another model class. This line at runtime will be replaced by code snippet. This code snippet, you didn't write it. It is already in Ruby framework, Ruby-based plugins that replace this code line by a code snippet to define the behavior and the wiring and the relation between the class post and the class comment as one-to-many relation, even in the database level. So you just write one code line, and this code line will, by beta programming, generate other code snippets at runtime. Ruby mainly written in C, basically written in C, but there are other Ruby implementations like Aaron Ruby. It is an open source implementation for Ruby programming language for .NET, for .NET developers, heavily relying on Microsoft Dynamic Language Runtime, and also JRuby. This is Java implementation of the Ruby programming language. Second part in our presentation talks about Rails. Rails is a web framework that is used to write web applications using Ruby. Ruby, you can write any application, desktop applications using Ruby. But to go to the web stack, you need to use another web framework. It's mainly called Rails. To write Ruby language, and Rails brings this application to the web. Ruby follows the MVC architecture, as is complete and self-oriented web stack, starting from database access level, like we said, active record is mapping between the class and the database table, to the HTTP routing level. What the key features of Rails to use as a web framework? First point is convention over configuration. You as a developer, you don't need to write every configuration line or every code line. You just provide the unconventional aspects of the application, and the rest Rails will provide to you. For example, if you have a class called user, and this class maps to a database table, you don't need to define this relation. User have a database table called users, but just build the table called user, and it corresponds to, by convention, a database table called users. You don't need to provide these configuration files. But even this default convention can be masked by explicit configuration if desired. Of course, this convention minimizes the code and configuration file. Second point, don't repeat yourself. We call it dry. Any piece of information or functionality is located in single and ambiguous place. يعني إيه الكلام ده? What's it mean? For example, a developer does not need to specify database columns in model classes definitions. While building your Rails application, you write some configuration files called database migrations. In these files, you define how the database table will be from the database, from the table name, its columns and the data types, and so on. And from the model side, you just build the class model. You don't need to repeat what you already written in the database migration. From the column names, you need to define the attributes. No need for that. Rails at runtime will fetch this information from the database and fill it inside the model class according to the convention class name. The third point is Rails. Ruby and Rails widely support plugins. You can extract the common business logic in your application, and you need to use it in other applications in what we said plugins, and these plugins in other Ruby and Rails applications. And this, of course, follows the meta-programming behavior of Ruby. If you look at this example, if you have a plugin that manages the attachment behavior of any class, you need to have a photo in your application, and this photo will retrieve files from a hard disk or a cloud hosting. You first add this plugin to your application, define a class called photo that already extends active record because it is mapped to a database table, and just write one line has attachment. And this line will, using meta-programming, replaced by a code snippet. This code snippet will be written from the plugin at runtime. This code snippet will give the behavior and the functionality for managing, loading, and saving the attachment file corresponds to this model class. The last point talks about entrepreneurs. How Ruby and Rails can help entrepreneurs. As we see, Ruby is a fast language. You can write small programs in fast time, rapid time, just very clear code lines because you write English. You don't need to define loops and so on. And Rails, by its key features from dry and convention by configuration, it provides you a fast way to build your web applications and mainly prototype. If you have an idea and you need to create a prototype in fast time, just go to Ruby and Rails to create your prototype in fast time. And in the same time, if you need to add some changes to this application, you of course changes are rapid. Okay, this is the end. This is my references. I try to give you a small introduction about Ruby and Rails, but I don't say everything. You need to read more about Ruby, and you can watch tutorials, video tutorials, screencasts. This is a great site, and this is my email. If you need any help, I can help you. Okay, questions? Thank you.